Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and let me know which city or country you're joining us from today. The silence of Julian Vance's penthouse was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, a high, thin hum that vibrated in the polished marble floors and the vast panes of glass that framed the city skyline. It was the sound of success, the sound of an empire forged from nothing, the sound of a life so meticulously curated that it had no room left for living. At 45, Julian was the sole architect of Vance Industries, a monolith of finance and tech that cast a long shadow over Wall Street. He had everything a man could want and nothing a man could need. His suits were tailored in London, his watches assembled in Switzerland, and his loneliness was crafted right here in this sterile palace 1,000 feet above the noise of the world. A leather-bound medical file lay on the polished surface of his obsidian desk. It was the only object in the entire 3-story apartment that was out of place. It was messy. It was real. Inside, cold, typed words gave a name to the shadow that had been growing behind his eyes, the pressure that felt like a clenched fist inside his skull. An inoperable high-grade glioma. The prognosis was as stark and unadorned as his minimalist decor. 3 months, maybe 4, with aggressive treatment that would only diminish what little quality of life he had left. He had opted for none. 3 months to get his affairs in order. But what affairs? His company was a well-oiled machine, designed to run without him. His will was simple, a series of trusts and endowments for charities he'd never visited, run by people he'd never met. He had no family, no wife. The great love of his life, Elena, had been taken by a sickness just as swift and merciless a decade ago. No children, no one to inherit the name, the fortune, or the crushing weight of this silent penthouse. His legacy would be a bronze plaque on a university library, a name on a hospital wing, cold, impersonal, forgotten. The irony was a bitter pill. He had spent his life building a fortress to keep the world out, only to find himself a prisoner within its walls, sentenced to die alone. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he put on a simple cashmere sweater and a pair of dark trousers, leaving the armor of his bespoke suit in the closet. He rode the private elevator down 60 floors, the quiet hum a prelude to the city's cacophony. He walked out of the gleaming lobby, past the doorman, who nodded with practiced deference, and into the raw, unfiltered pulse of the streets. He didn't have a destination. He just walked, letting the tide of humanity pull him along. He walked for miles, leaving the polished canyons of the financial district behind, moving into the older, grittier parts of the city. The buildings here were brick and stone, not glass and steel. The air smelled of exhaust and roasted nuts and the faint, damp scent of urban decay. It was a world away from his own, yet it was achingly familiar. This was where he'd started, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, with a widowed mother who worked her fingers raw. This was the world he had fought so hard to escape. He found himself standing across the street from a small, run-down playground. Rusted chains held cracked plastic seats on the swing set. The basketball hoop was missing its net, and there, huddled on a bench under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp, were 5 boys. They were a study in solidarity. The oldest, maybe 16 or 17, had a protective arm slung over the back of the bench, his gaze sharp and wary as he scanned the street. 2 middle boys, who looked uncannily alike, were sharing a bag of chips with a quiet, focused intensity. Another boy, lanky and thoughtful, was sketching in a tattered notebook with a pencil stub. And the youngest, no older than 7, was curled into the eldest's side, his small face illuminated by the passing headlights. They were street kids. It was obvious in their worn clothes, their guarded postures, the way they existed as a self-contained unit, a tiny island in the hostile sea of the city. Julian should have felt nothing. Pity, perhaps. A distant, charitable pang that would be satisfied by writing a check. But he felt something else. A strange, unnerving pull of recognition. It wasn't in their faces. It was in their resilience. It was in the fierce, unspoken loyalty that bound them together. He saw in them a ghost of himself, the hungry, driven boy who had clawed his way out of a life just like this. As he watched, a cold wind swept through the playground, carrying with it the first drops of a sudden downpour. The boys huddled closer. The youngest one shivered, and without a word, the oldest boy took off his own thin jacket, a threadbare thing that offered little protection, and wrapped it around the smaller child. He then pulled the boy fully into his lap, shielding him from the rain with his own body. The other 3 boys pressed in, creating a human wall against the elements. The gesture was so simple, so profound, that it struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. In that one small, selfless act, he saw more love and legacy than existed in his entire billion-dollar empire. He, Julian Vance, a man who could buy anything, would die in a sterile fortress of his own making, while this boy, who had nothing, was a king ruling over a kingdom of 4 loyal hearts. The thought was staggering. What was the meaning of his life, of his success, if it ended in such profound emptiness? What was a legacy of steel and glass compared to a legacy of warmth and protection? The medical file on his desk had given him a death sentence, but as he stood in the cold rain watching a band of homeless boys share their meager warmth, Julian Vance felt for the first time in a decade that he hadn't yet begun to live. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp, but he didn't feel the cold. He only felt the burn of a question that ignited in the hollow space of his chest. What if he didn't have to die alone? For the next week, the image of the 5 boys was seared into Julian's mind. It became an obsession, a puzzle that eclipsed the grim finality of his diagnosis. He canceled meetings. He ignored calls from his COO, a sharp and ambitious young man named Marcus Thorne. The hum of the penthouse felt different now, not peaceful, but predatory. The silence accused him. He could have hired a private investigator. A simple phone call, and he would have had a full dossier on each boy within hours. Names, ages, histories. But that felt clinical, detached. It felt like the old Julian, the man who managed life from a distance through intermediaries and reports. This was different. This was personal. So he did the investigating himself. Each evening, as the city bled from gold to indigo, he would return to the playground. He kept his distance, sitting in a black town car with tinted windows parked a block away, watching through a pair of powerful binoculars. It was a strange role for a titan of industry, a spy, a voyeur of poverty. He learned their routine. They used the playground as a base, a meeting point. They scattered during the day, likely looking for food or money, and regrouped at dusk. He started to put names to faces, picking them up from their own conversations carried on the wind. The leader was Leo. He moved with a coiled tension, his authority unquestioned. He was the guardian, the provider, the father. The lanky, quiet one was Sam. He was always reading or writing, his face a mask of concentration. He was the thinker, the strategist. The twins were Noah and Eli. They were a whirlwind of chaotic energy, always wrestling, always whispering, a 2-person support system. And the smallest, the one Leo had shielded from the rain, was Milo. He was the heart of their small tribe, his innocence a fragile flame they all protected. Julian watched them share a single hot dog 5 ways. He watched Leo confront a group of older teenagers who tried to bully them, his voice low and steady until they backed down. He saw Sam meticulously fold a dollar bill he'd earned and hand it to Leo for the family fund. He saw the twins find a discarded soccer ball and invent a game with rules that made sense only to them. He saw Milo draw a picture of their little family on the pavement with a piece of chalk he'd found, 5 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. With each observation, the pull grew stronger. It wasn't pity. It was a form of envy he had never experienced. He envied their connection, their absolute reliance on one another. They had nothing, yet they had everything that mattered. He started leaving things for them to find. One night it was a thick, warm blanket, still in its plastic packaging, left on the bench before they arrived. He watched from his car as they found it, the suspicion on Leo's face warring with the obvious relief. They accepted it, wrapping it around Milo first. The next night, it was a large, insulated bag filled with hot food from a nearby diner: burgers, fries, containers of soup. This time, Leo was more wary. He scanned the street, his eyes sweeping past Julian's car without seeing him. He opened one of the soup containers, sniffed it cautiously, and then took a small, hesitant bite. When he didn't immediately fall over, he nodded, and the boys devoured the food with a hunger that made Julian's chest ache. He was breaking his own rules. He was interfering. This wasn't a clean, tax-deductible donation to a registered charity. This was messy. This was direct. And it felt more meaningful than any check he had ever written. He began to learn their story in fragments, piecing it together from overheard whispers. Leo had run away from a violent foster home. The twins had been abandoned by their mother. Sam's parents were in jail. Milo. No one seemed to know where Milo came from. He'd just appeared one day, lost and alone, and they had taken him in. They weren't brothers by blood. They were brothers by choice. One evening, Julian's phone buzzed. It was his doctor's office. A sterile, cheerful voice on the other end reminded him of his appointment the following week. "Just to check in on your condition," the receptionist said, her voice laced with practiced sympathy. The word hung in the air inside the car. Condition. A death sentence packaged in a polite euphemism. The call was a splash of icy water. The clock was ticking. 3 months. No, less now. 10 weeks? 9? The days were slipping away like sand through his fingers. He looked through the binoculars. In the playground, Milo was coughing, a dry, racking sound. Leo had his hand on the boy's forehead, his young face etched with a concern that was ancient and paternal. Julian saw the helplessness in Leo's posture. He had no medicine, no doctor, no warm bed to offer. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Julian had a terminal diagnosis. He had a sprawling, empty home filled with silent, expensive things. He had a fortune that would soon be scattered to the winds of philanthropy. Across the street, 5 boys had life. They had love. But they had no home, no security, no future. The equation was so stark, so brutally simple, it was a revelation. His wealth wasn't a monument to his success. It was a tool, and it was rusting away, unused. He had spent his life accumulating assets. Now, in the final act of his life, he would make his most audacious acquisition yet. He wouldn't just give them a blanket or a meal. He would give them a home. He would give them a name. He would give them the future they deserved. The thought was insane. It was illogical, impractical, reckless. Child services, the courts, the press, they would tear him apart. A dying single billionaire trying to adopt 5 homeless children? It was the plot of some overwrought melodrama. But looking at Leo's desperate face, at Milo's small, shivering frame, Julian didn't care. For the first time, the cold calculation of the CEO gave way to the raw instinct of a protector. His worldview didn't just fracture, it vaporized. The legacy he had obsessed over, the empire of Vance Industries, suddenly seemed like a child's sandcastle. He picked up his phone and dialed his personal lawyer, a man who had handled billion-dollar mergers and hostile takeovers for him for 20 years. "Robert," Julian said, his voice firm, devoid of its usual weariness, "I need you to clear your schedule. We have work to do. I'm adopting." There was a pause on the other end. "Adopting? Sir, that's wonderful. A child?" Julian looked through the binoculars at the 5 boys huddled together on the park bench. "5," he said. "I'm adopting 5 children." The silence on the other end of the line was more profound than the silence in his penthouse had ever been. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. Not in Julian's sterile office or his intimidating penthouse, but on neutral ground. A private room in the back of the same diner from which he'd been ordering their food. He arrived early, his heart pounding with a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his first major business pitch decades ago. He'd instructed his lawyer, Robert, to begin the preliminary and highly confidential paperwork, a task Robert had accepted with the bewildered resignation of a man accustomed to his client's eccentricities, though this one topped them all. Julian had wondered how to get the boys here. In the end, he'd simply walked to the edge of the playground the night before, a figure emerging from the shadows. Leo had instantly put himself in front of the others, a fierce, wiry sentinel. "What do you want?" Leo's voice was low, suspicious. He recognized Julian as the man who had been watching them. "I'm the one who's been leaving the food," Julian said simply. "I want to talk. All of you? Tomorrow afternoon, I'll buy you lunch and you'll hear me out. That's all." He'd placed a card with the diner's address on the bench and walked away, leaving them to their decision. He didn't know if they would show up, but at precisely 1 o'clock, the door to the private room opened and 5 boys filed in. They moved as a unit, Leo in the lead, Milo clutching the back of his jeans, the others clustered behind. They looked cleaner than he'd ever seen them. They had clearly made an effort, washing up in a public restroom. Their gazes swept the room, taking in the clean table, the plush vinyl of the booth, and Julian himself. "Sit," Julian said, gesturing to the booth opposite him. They slid in, a tight row of wary faces. A waitress came, and Julian ordered 5 of everything: burgers, milkshakes, fries, onion rings, pie. The boys' eyes widened, but they said nothing. The food arrived, a mountain of it. For a few minutes, the only sound was the clinking of cutlery and the quiet, focused sounds of eating. Julian waited. He watched Sam's eyes dart around, analyzing him. He saw Noah and Eli sneak fries from each other's plates. He saw Leo making sure Milo ate his burger before touching his own. Finally, Leo pushed his empty plate away and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He fixed his gaze on Julian, and the look was unnervingly adult. "Okay, we ate. Now you talk. Why are you doing this? Nobody gives away free food for nothing. What's the catch?" Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches, full of legal assurances and financial promises. He discarded all of them. They deserved the truth, or at least a version of it he could give. "There's no catch," he began. "There's a situation. My situation. I have a very large house with many empty rooms, and I don't have much time left." The statement hung in the air. Sam stopped sketching on his napkin. Leo's posture didn't change, but a flicker of something, confusion, curiosity, crossed his face. "I'm sick," Julian stated, the words tasting like metal in his mouth. "The doctors say I have a few months. My whole life I've built things, companies, buildings, things that will last. But I've realized that's not a real legacy. It's just stuff. I have no family, no one." He looked at each of them, meeting their eyes. "And then I saw you. I saw how you protect each other. I saw a family, a real one, more real than anything I have. So you feel sorry for us?" Leo's voice was sharp, defensive. "We don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Julian said, his voice firm. "It's respect and an offer. I want to offer you a home, my home, not for a week or a month, for good. I want to adopt you." The word adopt landed like a stone in a silent pool. The twins, Noah and Eli, looked at each other, their expressions identical masks of disbelief. Sam's pencil stilled completely. Milo looked up at Leo, his big eyes searching for a translation of this impossible concept. Leo let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a sound full of bitterness and disbelief. Adopt us? You want to adopt us? A rich guy who's about to die wants to collect 5 street rats like we're some kind of final project? Is that it? You want to feel good about yourself before you kick the bucket? The words were brutal, but Julian didn't flinch. The boy had every right to his cynicism. Maybe, Julian admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. Maybe there's a part of that. But it's more than that. I can give you everything you need. A roof over your heads. Warm beds. All the food you can eat. I can put you in good schools. Sam, he said, looking at the quiet boy, my library has over 10,000 books. Noah, Eli, there's a basketball court on the roof. He was guessing, but he could have one installed in a day. Milo, you can have your own room, filled with any toy you want. He turned back to Leo. And you, Leo, you won't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders anymore. You can be a kid again. I can give you a future. A real one? College? Anything you want. All I ask in return is that you bring some life into my empty house before my time is up. Leo stared at him, his jaw tight. He was wrestling with a proposition that defied every law of his harsh reality. He looked at his brothers. He saw the flicker of hope in their eyes, a hope he had been trying so desperately to keep alive with scraps of food and thin jackets. His own defenses were a fortress, built brick by brick with every disappointment and betrayal. But he could see the cracks forming. Why us? Leo asked again, but this time the question was softer, less an accusation, and more a genuine plea for understanding. Julian thought for a moment, searching for the deepest, truest answer. Because when I was your age, I was you, he said quietly. Alone, hungry, angry, I got a lucky break. I'm offering you the same thing, a chance. You don't have to answer now. Think about it. Talk it over. The offer stands. He slid a new phone across the table, a simple, prepaid burner. My number is the only one in it. Call me when you have an answer. He stood up, paid the bill in cash, and walked out of the diner, leaving the 5 of them in the booth with a mountain of leftover food and a decision that could change everything. As he got into his car, he didn't know if he had just made the best or most foolish decision of his life. He only knew that for the first time, the ticking clock in his head felt less like a countdown to an end and more like the start of a race. The call came 2 days later. Julian was staring out his penthouse window, watching the distant lights of the city blur into a glittering tapestry, when the burner phone vibrated on his desk. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. It's Leo. The voice was clipped, businesslike. Leo, Julian said, keeping his own voice even. Have you decided? There was a long pause. Julian could hear faint, muffled whispers in the background, the sounds of the other boys. He imagined them huddled around Leo, a small committee, deliberating their fate. We have conditions, Leo said finally. Julian almost smiled. Of course he did. I'm listening. First, Leo said, his voice gaining strength, we stick together, all of us, no matter what. You take all 5, or you get none. That was always the deal, Leo, non-negotiable. Second, this isn't for forever. It's a trial. We try it. If it's not right, if you're not who you say you are, we walk. No questions asked. Fair enough, Julian agreed. What's the third condition? Another pause. This one was longer, heavier. You have to promise, Leo said, his voice dropping, losing its hard edge and revealing the boy beneath. You have to promise you won't just die and leave us on our own again. The question hit Julian like a punch to the gut. It was the one promise he couldn't possibly make. He closed his eyes, the sterile perfection of his penthouse mocking him. He was offering them a temporary haven in a sinking ship. Was it fair? Was it right? Leo, he said, his voice raspy with an emotion he couldn't name. I can't promise that I won't die. I can't promise I'll be here a year from now. But I can promise this. I will use every second I have left and every resource I possess to make sure that no matter what happens to me, you five will be safe. You will be taken care of. You will have a trust fund that will provide for you until you're adults. You will have guardians chosen by us together who will take over. You will never be back on that street again. I promise you that. He held his breath, waiting. He had offered the only truth he had. It was a flawed, heartbreaking promise, but it was an honest one. The silence stretched on. Finally, a small, quiet voice broke through. It was Milo. "Leo, can we go? I want to see the basketball court." Leo sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion and reluctant surrender. "Okay," he said to Julian, "we'll try." The arrival of the boys was less an event and more a quiet invasion. They appeared at the base of his gleaming office tower with a single battered backpack among them, containing all their worldly possessions. Julian met them in the lobby, the doorman looking on with a carefully neutral expression. As they rode up the silent, mirrored elevator, the boys stared at their own reflections, their faces a mixture of awe and trepidation. When the elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer, they stopped dead. Milo's jaw dropped. The twins, Noah and Eli, slowly spun in a circle, their eyes wide. Sam looked up at the vaulted ceilings as if trying to calculate the square footage. Only Leo remained impassive, his gaze sweeping the vast, open-plan living area like a general assessing enemy territory. The space was a monument to wealth and minimalism. White marble floors, black leather furniture, a grand piano that was never played, and walls of glass that made the city itself feel like an art installation. Into this silent, monochrome world, the five boys brought color and chaos. The first few days were a series of negotiations and adjustments. Julian showed them to their rooms, 5 identical suites on the second floor, each with a king-sized bed, a private bathroom, and a walk-in closet. He had instructed his staff to stock the closets with new clothes and the bathrooms with toiletries. Milo immediately jumped on his bed, disappearing into the plush duvet. Sam went straight to the desk and ran a hand over its smooth surface. The twins discovered that their rooms had an adjoining door and immediately began running back and forth. Leo just stood in the doorway of his room, his backpack still slung over his shoulder, as if he expected to be evicted at any moment. There were moments of surreal absurdity. Julian, a man who negotiated 9-figure deals, found himself explaining how to use a rainfall showerhead. He, who had dined with heads of state, found himself watching Milo discover the magic of a refrigerator with an ice dispenser. He hired a private chef, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who was initially flustered by the request for macaroni and cheese and chicken nuggets, but quickly adapted, her warm presence a welcome buffer in the vast home. But the bonding, the true connection, happened in the small, unguarded moments. One evening, Julian found Sam in the library, not reading, but just standing in the middle of the room, turning in a slow circle. "It's," Sam said, unable to find the word. "It's a lot, I know," Julian replied. "I've never seen so many books that weren't in a public building," Sam whispered, running a reverent hand along a row of leather-bound classics. Can I read any of them?" "They're all yours, Sam," Julian said, and the brilliant, grateful smile he received in return was worth more than any stock option. A few days later, a crash echoed from the main living area. Julian walked in to find Noah and Eli standing over the shattered remains of a large, abstract crystal sculpture that had cost more than a luxury car. They were frozen, their faces pale with terror, expecting an explosion of anger. Julian looked at the pile of glittering shards, then at their terrified faces. He felt nothing. Not for the object. "Is anyone hurt?" he asked, his voice calm. They both shook their heads, speechless. Good, Julian said. He called for a member of his housekeeping staff. Get this cleaned up, please. He looked back at the boys. It was just a thing. A stupid, ugly thing. Don't worry about it. He walked away, leaving them staring after him in stunned silence. He could feel Leo's eyes on him from the doorway, watching, analyzing. The distrust was still there, but it was being chipped away piece by piece. The true turning point came a week later. Milo woke up in the middle of the night crying. It wasn't a sad cry, it was a cry of pain. Julian was awake, as he often was, the pressure in his head a dull, constant companion. He was the first to reach the boy's room. Milo was huddled in his bed, feverish and whimpering, complaining of a sharp pain in his stomach. Leo was right behind him, his face a mask of fear. "He gets these sometimes," Leo said, his voice tight. "It usually passes." But Julian could see this was different. The boy's skin was hot to the touch, and he was breathing in shallow gasps. The old Julian would have delegated, calling a doctor to make a house call. The new Julian reacted on pure instinct. He scooped the small, trembling boy into his arms. "Leo, get your brothers. We're going to the hospital." The ride to the emergency room was a blur of sirens and flashing lights, a privilege his name and number afforded. Julian held Milo, murmuring reassurances, while the other 4 boys sat in a silent, terrified row in the back of the private ambulance he had summoned. At the hospital, a place Julian owned a significant portion of, they were rushed into a private wing. It was appendicitis. Acute. They needed to operate immediately. Julian found himself signing consent forms, his hand surprisingly steady. He was listed as guardian pending adoption. As they wheeled Milo into surgery, Leo grabbed Julian's arm, his composure finally breaking. "Is he going to be okay?" the teenager asked, his voice cracking, all his carefully constructed bravado gone. Julian put a firm hand on his shoulder. "He's in the best hospital in the country, with the best surgeon. I'm not going to let anything happen to him, I promise." They waited for hours in a private lounge. Julian ordered food, but no one ate. He sat with the 4 boys, a silent, anxious vigil. He wasn't their father, not yet. He was a dying man playing a role, but as he looked at their worried faces, at Leo pacing the floor, at Sam trying to distract the twins, he felt a fierce primal wave of protectiveness that was utterly real. These were his boys, his. When the surgeon finally came out, smiling, and said the operation was a success and Milo was in recovery, the collective sigh of relief in the room was a palpable thing. Leo slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands, and for the first time, when Julian put a hand on his back, the boy didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch. Julian stayed at the hospital all night, sleeping in a chair by Milo's bed. When he woke, the morning light was streaming through the window, and Milo was stirring. The little boy's eyes fluttered open and found Julian's. "You stayed," Milo whispered, his voice groggy. "I told you I would," Julian said softly. A small smile touched Milo's lips. "Good," he said, and closed his eyes again, falling into a peaceful, healing sleep. In that moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the child's chest, Julian felt a profound shift within him. The cold dread of his own mortality, the constant companion of the last few months, had receded. It was still there, a shadow in the corner, but it was no longer the center of his world. The center of his world was right here, in this hospital room. He was no longer just a dying man. He was a father. The news of Julian Vance's new family rippled through the upper echelons of the city's financial world like a seismic shock. It was the kind of gossip that was too bizarre, too outlandish to be true, yet too compelling to ignore. Whispers followed Julian's name at board meetings and charity galas he no longer attended. He was eccentric, they said, unstable, grief-stricken, and losing his mind in his final days, Julian ignored it all. His world had shrunk to the confines of the penthouse and the 5 young lives that now filled it with noise, laughter, and an endless array of new challenges. He was learning to be a parent on the fly, a crash course in everything from quadratic equations for Sam to mediating disputes between Noah and Eli over a video game controller. His second-in-command, Marcus Thorne, could not ignore it. Marcus was the consummate protege. Sharp, impeccably dressed, and ruthlessly ambitious, he had modeled his entire career, his entire life, on Julian's. He had been a loyal lieutenant for years, managing the day-to-day operations of Vance Industries with cold efficiency, patiently waiting in the wings. He viewed himself not just as the COO, but as the heir apparent. Julian's diagnosis had been a secret tragedy for him, but also, in a cold, calculating corner of his heart, an opportunity. He would be the one to carry the Vance legacy forward. Then came the boys. Marcus first saw them when he made an unannounced visit to the penthouse to discuss an urgent matter regarding the long-gestating merger with a Japanese tech conglomerate, a deal that was to be the crowning achievement of Julian's career. He stepped out of the elevator into a scene of domestic chaos. A half-built Lego castle dominated the living room floor. The pristine white marble was smudged with what looked suspiciously like chocolate fingerprints. And the air, usually still and silent, was filled with the sound of a cartoon and 2 boys arguing. Julian emerged from the kitchen, not in a suit, but in a simple knit sweater, with a small, dark-haired boy, Milo, trailing behind him, holding a half-eaten apple. "Marcus," Julian said, a genuine smile touching his lips. It was a look Marcus hadn't seen on his boss's face in years. "I wasn't expecting you." Marcus stared, his briefcase feeling unnaturally heavy in his hand. Julian. "I tried calling. The Nakatomi merger, there's a development." "It can wait," Julian said, his attention already shifting back to Milo. "We're about to watch a movie." Marcus was dismissed. He, Marcus Thorne, who held the fate of a multi-billion-dollar deal in his hands, was dismissed for a movie. He watched as Julian settled onto the couch, the one that had been a piece of art, and pulled the small boy next to him. The other boys drifted in and sat down, forming a protective circle. Marcus felt like an intruder, a ghost from a past life. His concern curdled into alarm when, a few days later, he was copied on an email from Julian's personal lawyer, Robert. Attached were the preliminary drafts of the adoption papers and, more importantly, revised documents for Julian's personal trust. The vast fortune, the controlling stake in Vance Industries that Marcus had assumed would be placed in a corporate trust he would oversee, was being redirected. A new irrevocable trust was being established for the benefit of 5 beneficiaries: Leo, Samuel, Noah, Elias, and Milo Vance. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. This wasn't a whim. This wasn't a temporary act of charity. Julian was giving his kingdom away. To them. To a pack of street urchins who had appeared out of nowhere. Everything Marcus had worked for, everything he had sacrificed his personal life for, was being handed over to children who couldn't even spell fiduciary. Rage, cold and pure, settled in his heart. It was a betrayal. Julian was squandering his legacy, destroying the very empire Marcus had dedicated his life to preserving. He saw it as his duty, not just to himself, but to the company, to the name of Vance, to intervene. Julian was clearly not of sound mind. He was a dying man being manipulated by street-smart grifters. Marcus had to act. His first move was subtle. He used his extensive contacts, planting a seed of a story with a notorious society gossip columnist. He framed it as a tragedy. The brilliant but ailing Julian Vance, his judgment clouded by illness, had taken in a group of homeless youths. Questions of stability and fitness were raised. Was it a safe environment? Was this impulsive act truly in the best interests of the children? Or was it the erratic behavior of a man facing his own mortality? The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, never directly accusing, but painting a damning picture. It was followed by a more direct, insidious attack. Marcus made an anonymous phone call. He used a burner phone, his voice disguised, and contacted the city's administration for children's services. He reported a troubling situation. A terminally ill single man with no experience with children had taken 5 high-risk, vulnerable minors into his home without any official oversight. He expressed grave concern for the children's welfare, knowing the bureaucracy would be forced to investigate. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Julian was at the large dining table, a place that had once been for solitary meals, helping Noah and Eli with a diorama for a school project. Leah was reading a history textbook nearby, and Sam was explaining a complex coding problem to an intrigued Julian. The penthouse, for the first time, felt like a home. Then the phone rang. It was Robert, his lawyer. His voice was grim. "Julian, we have a problem, a big one. ACS is opening an investigation into your fitness as a guardian. They received an anonymous tip. They want to schedule an emergency home visit and hearing immediately." Julian felt a cold dread creep back in, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Milo's surgery. This was an attack, a direct assault on his new family. He didn't know who was behind it, but he knew what they were targeting: his illness, his inexperience, the very unconventional nature of their family. They were trying to take his boys away. The thought was unbearable. "And Julian," Robert added, his voice heavy, "that's not all. Marcus Thorne just called me. He said the Nakatomi board is flying in from Tokyo. They've moved up the final signing. It's for this Friday, the same day ACS has scheduled the hearing." The two events collided in Julian's mind. The culmination of his life's work, the deal that would secure his corporate legacy forever, was happening on the exact same day as the hearing that would determine the fate of his human legacy. It was too perfect to be a coincidence. Suddenly, he saw it all with sickening clarity. The gossip column, the anonymous tip, the scheduling conflict. It all led back to one person, the loyal protege, the heir apparent, Marcus. Marcus was trying to force his hand, to make him choose: the company or the children, the empire or the family. For the old Julian Vance, it would have been no choice at all. Business always came first. But as he looked across the table at the faces of his sons, at the 5 boys who had crashed into his life and filled its empty spaces with purpose, he knew that the old Julian Vance was well and truly dead. The day of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, the sky a blanket of steel that mirrored the knot of anxiety in Julian's stomach. A storm was brewing outside and inside. He had spent the last 2 days preparing with Robert, assembling character references, school reports, and psychological evaluations for the boys. But he knew the opposition's case was brutally simple and effective. He was a dying man. What long-term stability could he possibly offer? That morning, Marcus Thorne made his final, bold move. He arrived at the penthouse, his face a mask of feigned concern. The boys were in their rooms, getting ready. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk, "this is a mess, a complete travesty. Let me handle it. I've already spoken to our lawyers. They can send a team to the ACS hearing, file for continuances, bog them down in paperwork for months. You don't need this stress. You need to be at the Nakatomi signing. It's at 2 o'clock. The hearing is at 2:30. You can't be in 2 places at once." He placed his hand on Julian's shoulder. "This deal is your legacy, Julian. It's the masterpiece of your career. Don't let these complications tarnish it. Let me be your proxy at the hearing. I'll tell them whatever they need to hear. You go and sign that deal. Solidify the empire. It's what matters." Julian looked at the man he had once considered a son. He saw the cold ambition in his eyes, the utter conviction that a company was more important than people, that a legacy was something you built from steel and stock certificates, not love and loyalty. In Marcus, Julian saw the ghost of who he used to be. "Thank you for your concern, Marcus," Julian said, his voice quiet but laced with ice, "but I know where I need to be." At 2:30, Julian walked into a sterile, impersonal conference room at the ACS building. He wasn't flanked by a team of corporate lawyers, but by Leo, who had insisted on coming. The other 4 boys were with Mrs. Gable in a nearby waiting room. On one side of the table sat Julian, Leo, and Robert. On the other sat Ms. Diaz, a stern-faced, weary-looking case manager, and a city-appointed child advocate. Ms. Diaz laid out the case against him bluntly. The anonymous report raised valid concerns: his terminal health, his lack of parental experience, the sudden and dramatic change in the children's living situation. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone not unkind but firm, "our mandate is the long-term stability and well-being of the children. With all due respect, you can't guarantee that." Robert began to argue, citing the trust funds, the guardianship documents, the expert testimonies, but Julian held up a hand, silencing him. He needed to say this himself. "Ms. Diaz," he began, his voice clear and steady, "you are correct. I cannot guarantee that I will be here next year or even next month. The doctors gave me a timeline, and it's a short one, and for that reason, every single day I have left is infinitely precious. Before these boys came into my life, I was waiting to die in an empty, silent apartment. My legacy was a name on a building. I was a ghost in my own life." He turned his gaze to Leo, who sat ramrod straight beside him. "These boys, they're not a project. They are not a whim. They are the single most important thing I have ever done. They brought life back into my world. They've given my last days a purpose that $100 billion deals never could." "You speak of stability? In the few weeks we have been together, we have become a family. Is there anything more stable than that?" He slid a folder across the table. "In there are my plans for their future. Guardians they have chosen. Financial security that will last their entire lives. But that's just paper. What I am offering them, for as long as I am able, is a home and a father." Just as he finished, his phone, sitting on the table, buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Nakatomi board is waiting. This is your last chance, Julian. Don't throw it all away." Julian glanced at the message and slid the phone back into his pocket without a second thought. He had already made his choice. He had walked away from the deal, from the empire, from the legacy Marcus coveted. He had chosen them. Ms. Diaz looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "That's a very moving sentiment, Mr. Vance. But my concern remains your health?" Her words were cut off by a knock on the door. It opened to reveal a man in a doctor's coat, looking flustered. It was Dr. Aris, Julian's own oncologist. Robert, taking the initiative, had called him as a surprise witness. "I apologize for the interruption," Dr. Aris said, holding up a file. "But I just came from reviewing Mr. Vance's latest scans. We took them yesterday to monitor his condition under stress." He opened the file on the table, his expression one of professional bewilderment. "Medicine is a science of patterns, but sometimes we see things that defy explanation. Mr. Vance's tumor, the one we diagnosed as a highly aggressive, inoperable glioma, it's shrinking." A collective silence fell over the room. Julian stared at the doctor, his mind struggling to process the words. "We were wrong," Dr. Aris continued, shaking his head in disbelief. "The initial biopsy was misleading. It's an incredibly rare variant. It presents aggressively, but it responds to a new immunotherapy treatment. It's not a death sentence, Mr. Vance. It's a fight, a hard one, with no guarantees. But it's a fight you have a very real chance of winning." The room was silent. Leo stared at Julian, his jaw agape. Robert was smiling broadly. Ms. Diaz looked from the doctor to the scan results, her stern facade crumbling. The world had just tilted on its axis. 3 months. The deadline that had defined his every action, the premise upon which his entire plan was built, had just evaporated. He wasn't a dying man making a final gesture. He was a man with a future he would get to spend with his sons. The relief and joy that washed over him was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at Leo, and for the first time he saw not a trace of suspicion or doubt in the boy's eyes. He just saw awe and a dawning brilliant hope. He stood up, his legs feeling stronger than they had in months. He knew what he had to do. He addressed Ms. Diaz. "I believe this changes things." Then he turned to Robert. "Get Marcus Thorne on the phone." The final piece of his old life needed to be excised. He had a family to fight for and a life to live. 1 year later. The silence in the penthouse was a distant memory, a ghost of a former life. Now it was a symphony of living. The rhythmic thump of a basketball on the rooftop court, the faint sound of a piano being played, haltingly but with feeling, the low murmur of a television, and the constant overlapping chatter of 5 boys. The pristine white marble floors now bore the occasional scuff mark, and a colorful, chaotic painting by Milo, framed exquisitely, had replaced the cold crystal sculpture that had once stood in the living room. Julian Vance sat on the sprawling sofa, a book open in his lap, though he wasn't reading. He was listening. He looked different. The sharp, gaunt angles of his face had softened. The immunotherapy had been grueling, a battle that had tested his every reserve, but he had faced it with a resolve he never would have possessed a year ago. He had something to fight for. The cancer was in remission, and his doctors were cautiously optimistic. He was tired, but it was the good, honest fatigue of a day well lived, not the soul-deep weariness of a man waiting for the end. Sam was the one at the grand piano, picking out a melody from a beginner's book. His natural aptitude for patterns and logic had translated beautifully to music. Noah and Eli were the source of the thumping from the roof, their boundless energy finding a perfect outlet in endless games of one-on-one. Milo was curled up at the other end of the sofa, watching a cartoon, his feet tucked under Julian's leg. And Leo walked in from the library, a stack of college brochures in his hand. He had shed the weight of the world he had carried for so long. The wary, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by the bright, ambitious spark of a young man looking toward a future full of possibilities. He sat down in the armchair opposite Julian, dropping the brochures on the coffee table. "Still can't decide?" Julian asked, a warm smile on his face. "It's between the State University's engineering program and that private arts college on the coast," Leo said, running a hand through his hair. "Big choice." "You'll make the right one," Julian said with absolute confidence. After the hearing, everything had changed. The adoption was finalized with the court's enthusiastic approval. The story, when it finally broke, was not the one of scandal Marcus had intended, but one of hope and second chances. Marcus Thorne was gone, dismissed for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Vance Industries was now run by a new board, with Julian serving as a remote chairman. His priorities had been irrevocably reordered. His empire was no longer his legacy. This was his 5 sons. He looked at the empty space on the wall above the fireplace, a space that for a decade had held a painful void. Yesterday they had hung a new portrait there. It was a photo taken just last week in a park. It showed Julian looking healthy and happy, surrounded by 5 boys, all of them smiling, all of them safe, all of them home, all of them with his name, Vance. Milo stirred, shifting closer to him. "Dad?" he mumbled sleepily. The words still sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy through Julian's heart every time he heard it. "Yes, Milo?" "I'm glad you didn't die," the boy said with the simple, profound honesty of a child. Julian put his arm around his youngest son, pulling him close. He looked at the portrait on the wall, at the faces of the family he had found in the twilight of one life and the dawn of another. They had come into his world to give his death meaning, but instead they had given him a reason to live. The doctors called his recovery a medical miracle. Julian knew better. It was the simple, everyday miracle of a family. "Me too, son," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Me too."